The last place anyone saw Yessenia Gabriella Norman was not a dark alley or an unfamiliar street. It was somewhere that felt ordinary. On January 15, 2026, the 18-year-old left the transitional housing facility where she was living in Phoenix and told staff she was going out. There was no argument, no sign of distress, no indication that anything about that night was different from any other moment of teenage independence. She never came back. At first, the concern was quiet. Yessenia was young, but she wasn't reckless. She was preparing to start classes at Glendale Community College. She talked about school, about her future, about finally building something stable for herself. She didn't disappear without reason. But days passed. January 16th turned into January 17th, then the 18th. By January 19th, Yessenia Gabriella Norman was officially reported missing. Her phone went unanswered. Messages sat unread. The absence that once felt explainable now felt heavy. Wrong in a way that's hard to describe until you've lived it. The kind of wrong that settles in your chest and refuses to move. Police began searching, retracing her steps, asking the questions families hate hearing out loud. Who was she meeting? Where was she going? Did anyone know the man she had connected with online through a social media dating site? At that point, Yessenia was still a missing person. There was still hope. That hope would not survive January 28th. That morning, officers in Tolleson, Arizona, responded to a call from residents at an apartment complex on 91st Avenue. Neighbors had reported a foul smell coming from one of the units, strong enough that it couldn't be ignored. When police entered the apartment, they found Yessenia's body. She had been stabbed 27 times. Investigators would later confirm that her body had been mutilated. The violence was extreme, personal, deliberate. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of panic. This was a homicide. The apartment was leased to a 27-year-old man named Randal Basilio Santillan, the same man Yessenia had gone to meet days earlier. By the time police identified him as a suspect, he was already gone. He had fled the state. What followed was a multi-state search that stretched far beyond Arizona, involving license plate readers, cell phone data, and federal coordination. At every mile he traveled, widened the distance between Yessenia's final moments and the answers her family desperately needed. On February 6, 2026, authorities located and arrested Santillan in Biloxi, Mississippi. He now faces charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping and is awaiting extradition back to Arizona. But no arrest could undo what had already been done. Yessenia Gabriella Norman was 18 years old. She was a student, a daughter, a young woman standing at the edge of adulthood, believing she had time. This is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about trust, about how ordinary moments can turn fatal, about how a single decision to meet someone, to believe someone, can intersect with unimaginable violence. And as investigators continue to piece together what happened inside that apartment, one truth remains impossible to escape. Yessenia did not just go missing. She was taken. And someone knew exactly what they were doing when they took her. When investigators say a case starts at the beginning, they rarely mean the moment a life ends. They mean the moment nothing seems wrong. For Yessenia Gabriella Norman, that moment came on January 15, 2026, in Phoenix, Arizona. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It didn't look like the opening scene of a tragedy. It looked like an 18-year-old girl doing what millions of people her age do every day, stepping out into the world, believing she had control over her own choices. Yessenia was living in a transitional housing facility at the time. It was a structured place, meant to provide stability while young people worked toward independence. She had rules, check-ins, our expectations, but she also had freedom. She was preparing to start classes at Glendale Community College. She talked about school with a mix of nervousness and excitement, the way people do when they're standing at the edge of something new. That day, she told staff she was heading out. There was no argument, no hesitation, no sense that she was running away from anything. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't take personal belongings that would suggest she was leaving for good. She left the way people leave when they expect to return. What few people knew at the time was that Yessenia had been talking to someone online, a man she had connected with through a social media dating site. The conversations, as far as investigators could later tell, didn't raise immediate red flags. There were no messages indicating fear, no sudden change in tone, no warnings sent to friends. It looked ordinary. That ordinariness would later become one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Because when something horrible happens, people instinctively search for signs they missed. Something obvious. Something that could have been stopped. But with Yessenia, there were no clear warning lights flashing in advance. Just a young woman navigating adulthood in a world that often overestimates how safe normal really is. When she didn't return that night, no alarms were triggered right away. Transitional housing staff were accustomed to residents staying out late. Friends assumed she was busy. Maybe she stayed overnight somewhere. Maybe she'd explain it later. The first night passed quietly. So did the second. By the third day, the silence began to feel different. Yessenia wasn't answering calls. Messages went unread. The people who knew her best began to feel that familiar, creeping dread, the kind that doesn't come from evidence, but from instinct. The sense that something isn't just delayed, but wrong. On January 19th, 4 days after she was last seen, Yessenia Gabriela Norman was officially reported missing. Once a person is classified as missing, the world changes shape around them. Time becomes elastic. Every hour feels heavier than the last. Every phone vibration sparks hope, followed by disappointment. The mind cycles endlessly through possibilities, ranging from the comforting to the unbearable. Police began their search by asking the most basic questions. When was she last seen? Who was she with? Where was she going? That was when the online connection came into focus. And investigators learned that Yessenia had planned to meet the man she had been communicating with online. A meeting that, at the time, felt routine. Millions of people meet others this way every year. There was nothing outwardly unusual about it. But unlike millions of others, Yessenia never came home. As days passed, her face began to circulate. Missing person posts appeared on social media. Her name spread beyond her immediate circle, carried by strangers who shared her photo, hoping visibility might bring answers. Tips trickled in, some hopeful, some confusing, some contradictory. Police worked methodically, following digital trails, phone records, app activity, location data, surveillance cameras, the quiet, invisible infrastructure that watches modern life even when we don't notice it. Those tools began to narrow the search. The investigators traced Yessenia's final known movements to an apartment complex in Tolleson, Arizona, on 91st Avenue. It was not a place anyone initially associated with danger. No emergency calls, no disturbance reports, no reason for neighbors to believe something violent had happened there. Until January 28th. Nearly 2 weeks after Yessenia was last seen, residents at the complex noticed a foul odor coming from one of the apartments. It lingered. It grew stronger. It was impossible to ignore. When police arrived and entered the unit, hope vanished. Inside, they found Yessenia's body. The discovery marked a turning point, not just in the investigation, but in the lives of everyone connected to her. In an instant, the question changed from, "Where is she?" to "What happened to her?" But investigators confirmed that Yessenia had been stabbed 27 times. The number itself was staggering. It spoke not just of violence, but of duration, of sustained harm, of an attack that did not stop when it could have. Her body had been mutilated. These were not details shared lightly. Law enforcement avoided unnecessary descriptions, but the meaning was clear. This was not an accident. This was not self-defense. This was an intentional, brutal act. The apartment where her body was found was leased to a 27-year-old man named Randal Basilio Santillan, the same man Yessenia had gone to meet. By the time police identified him as the primary suspect, Santillan was gone. The absence of the suspect immediately escalated the case. And this was no longer just about understanding what happened. It was about finding someone who appeared to be actively avoiding responsibility. Investigators quickly realized this was not a simple disappearance followed by a tragic discovery. It was a case that crossed state lines. Santillan had left Arizona. Using license plate readers, cell phone data, and coordinated efforts across jurisdictions, law enforcement began tracking his movements. Every mile he traveled was another reminder that Yessenia could not. Her family learned the truth the way most families do, not all at once, but in pieces. First, that she was missing. Then, that she had been found. Then, how she had died. Each update felt like a separate loss layered on top of the last. Grief doesn't arrive cleanly. It arrives tangled with shock, disbelief, anger, and an endless loop of unanswered questions. Why that man? Why that day? Why did no one stop this? Yessenia was 18 years old. She had not yet started college. She had not yet built the life she talked about. She had plans so ordinary they felt guaranteed. After her death, her family organized a GoFundMe, not for legal battles, not for memorials, but for burial costs. The final, painful logistics that follow violence. The practical weight of loss added to emotional devastation. As the investigation continued, authorities confirmed that Santillan was arrested on February 6, 2026, in Biloxi, Mississippi. He was taken into custody without incident, nearly 1,500 miles from the apartment where Yessenia's life ended. He now faces charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping and is awaiting extradition to Arizona. But at the time Chapter 1 of this story ends, the arrest has not yet happened. At this point in the timeline, Yessenia's family is still suspended between shock and disbelief. Investigators are still reconstructing events. The suspect is still moving freely somewhere in the country. And one question hangs over everything. What happened inside that apartment between the moment Yessenia walked in believing she was safe and the moment she was silenced forever? That question would become the center of everything that followed, and answering it would reveal just how thin the line is between ordinary life and irreversible tragedy. By the time investigators officially named Randal Basilio Santillan as the suspect, they were already certain of one thing: Yessenia Gabriela Norman had not died by chance. This was not a random act of violence. It was not a burglary gone wrong. It was not a spontaneous argument that spiraled out of control. This was personal. The evidence inside the apartment on 91st Avenue told a story that no witness could speak aloud. The position of her body, the lack of forced entry, the absence of her phone. Every detail pointed to the same conclusion. Yessenia had gone there willingly, and the danger came from the person who was supposed to meet her, not from the outside world. Investigators began rebuilding the timeline with precision. They examined the days between January 15th, when Yessenia was last seen, and January 28th, when her body was discovered. That gap, nearly 2 weeks, became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. For all that time, her body remained inside that apartment, while life outside continued as normal. People walked past the door. Cars came and went. No one knew what was hidden behind the walls. Police focused heavily on digital evidence. Even without Yessenia's phone, technology provided fragments of her final movements. App records confirmed she had been communicating with Santillan through a social media dating platform. Messages showed a gradual build of familiarity, not a rushed interaction. There was no indication of fear, no message suggesting she felt unsafe. That absence of warning haunted detectives, because it meant Yessenia likely did not realize she was in danger until it was already happening. Investigators believe that once inside the apartment, something changed. What exactly triggered the violence has not been publicly detailed. But the nature of her injuries made one thing clear. This was not a single moment of loss of control. 27 stab wounds told a story of sustained aggression, of repeated decisions to continue. After Yessenia was killed, Santillan did not report the incident. He did not call emergency services. He did not seek help. Instead, he took steps that suggested awareness and intent. He removed her phone, he left the apartment, and he fled Arizona. That decision to run became the defining action of the days that followed. It shifted the investigation from a local homicide to a multi-state manhunt. Law enforcement agencies across jurisdictions began coordinating, sharing data, tracking movements. License plate readers picked up Santillan's vehicle far from Phoenix. Cell phone data placed him moving steadily east. Each data point tightened the net, even as the distance grew. For Yessenia's family, these developments were surreal. They were still trying to process the fact that she was gone at all when they were suddenly hearing about suspects, charges, and interstate searches. Grief did not pause for the investigation. It ran alongside it, relentless and unstructured. Her family spoke publicly, asking for justice, but also for dignity. They wanted the focus to remain on who Yessenia was, not just on how she died. They talked about her plans for Glendale Community College, about her excitement to start classes, about the future she believed was finally opening up. Those details mattered, because in cases like this, victims are often reduced to the moment they were harmed. Yessenia was more than that moment. She was a young woman standing at the beginning of her life, trusting that the world would meet her with the same openness she offered it. As the search for Santillan continued, prosecutors began preparing charges even before he was in custody. First-degree murder, kidnapping. The inclusion of kidnapping reflected the belief that Yessenia had been held against her will, that her freedom had been taken before her life was. Meanwhile, the apartment where she was found remained sealed. A quiet, ordinary-looking unit that now carried the weight of an unimaginable act. Neighbors who had reported the smell struggled to reconcile what they had unknowingly lived beside. Many expressed guilt, wondering if they should have noticed sooner, if something could have been done. But hindsight offers clarity without comfort. But the reality was this: the crime had been concealed deliberately, and nothing about it invited immediate discovery. On February 6, 2026, nearly 3 weeks after Yessenia was last seen, authorities located Randal Basilio Santillan in Biloxi, Mississippi. He was arrested without incident. No resistance, no dramatic confrontation, just handcuffs and the end of his attempt to outrun the consequences. For law enforcement, the arrest marked a major step forward. For Yessenia's family, it was something far more complicated. Relief mixed with anger. Validation mixed with unbearable sadness. Knowing who was responsible did not soften the loss. It only made it more concrete. Santillan now faced extradition back to Arizona, where he would stand before a judge and answer for what investigators believed he had done. And the legal process would move slowly, deliberately, governed by procedures that felt painfully detached from the emotional reality of the crime. As the case moved toward court, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not just a story about meeting the wrong person online. It was a story about vulnerability, about how trust can be weaponized, about how easily violence can hide behind normal conversation and familiar language. And as Yessenia's name continued to appear in court documents and news reports, the question shifted once again from who did this to how would justice be defined? Because no sentence, no charge, no verdict could ever return what was taken. The courtroom did not feel like a place where answers lived. It felt like a place where silence had been given rules. Wooden benches, neutral walls, a seal on the wall that promised justice without ever explaining what justice was supposed to feel like. For Yessenia Gabriella Norman's family, this room was not about resolution. It was about endurance, about surviving the slow, grinding process of hearing their daughter's life discussed in fragments and legal language. By the time Randal Basilio Santillan was extradited back to Arizona, the public already knew his name. But knowing a name and understanding a loss are two very different things. Outside the courtroom, reporters spoke about charges and procedures. Inside, Yessenia's family carried something heavier, the knowledge that every detail shared would pull her closer, then take her away again. The prosecution laid out the case carefully, piece by piece, as if precision could soften the horror. They spoke of January 15, 2026, of Yessenia leaving her transitional housing facility, of her plans to meet someone she believed she knew well enough. They described how trust was built through conversation, how familiarity grew through screens, how ordinary it all seemed. They showed timelines reconstructed from digital data, messages, app activity, location pings. They spoke of an apartment on 91st Avenue, of doors that closed, of a young woman who entered alive and never left. When the medical examiner's findings were introduced, the room seemed to contract. 27 stab wounds, the word mutilation. Language that felt clinical on paper but devastating in the air. The prosecution did not linger on these details. They didn't need to. The number alone spoke volumes. It told the jury that this was not an impulsive act. It told them this was sustained violence, her repeated decisions, a refusal to stop. Then they turned to what happened after. They described the absence of a 911 call, the lack of any attempt to get help, the deliberate removal of Yessenia's phone, the flight from Arizona, the miles added between the crime and Mississippi. They made one thing very clear. People do not run like that when something is accidental. The defense argued predictably. They spoke of ambiguity, of moments escalating, of emotions. They avoided the word choice. They avoided the number 27. They focused instead on hypotheticals, on doubt, on what could not be definitively known. But every attempt to blur the narrative ran into the same immovable fact. Yessenia did not walk out of that apartment, and the man who lived there did. As the trial progressed, and the public's attention waned the way it always does, new headlines replaced old ones. But for Yessenia's family, time did not dull anything. Each day in court reopened the wound. Each witness forced them to imagine moments they would have given anything not to picture. When it was time for victim impact statements, the room changed. This was no longer about evidence, no longer about arguments. This was about the cost. Yessenia's family stood and spoke, not as legal participants, but as people who had lost a daughter, a sister, a future they would never see unfold. They spoke about who she was before January 15th, about her plans to attend Glendale Community College, about her excitement, her nervousness, her belief that life was finally stabilizing. Her mother spoke slowly, deliberately, as if each word had weight. She talked about watching Yessenia grow, about her laughter, about her stubbornness, about the way she talked about school, about wanting something better for herself. She spoke of unanswered phone calls, of a bedroom that still smelled like her daughter, of the quiet that now filled their home. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for accountability. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, the words felt both decisive and hollow. A life sentence, legal closure, a declaration that what happened mattered under the law. But law cannot balance loss. There was no moment of relief, no sense of completion. The family did not cry out. They did not celebrate. They simply sat there, absorbing the final confirmation that Yessenia was not coming back. Outside the courtroom, the world continued as it always does. Cars passed. People checked their phones. Life moved forward without hesitation. Yessenia's family stepped into that world carrying a grief that had no expiration date. In the weeks and months that followed, her name faded from the headlines, but it did not fade from the lives it had shattered. Her family organized her belongings slowly, carefully, as if rushing would erase her. Her phone number remained saved in contacts. Her photos remained on walls and screens. They learned that grief does not shrink. It rearranges itself. It shows up in quiet moments, in sudden memories, in plans that no longer make sense. The GoFundMe created to help with burial costs became a painful reminder of how violence leaves behind not only emotional devastation, but practical burdens. Funerals, paperwork, expenses no family should have to think about while mourning an 18-year-old. As conversations about the case continued online, debates erupted about dating apps, about safety, about responsibility, about what young women should or shouldn't do. But those debates often missed the most important truth. Yessenia did not make a mistake that led to her death. Someone made a choice that ended her life. Reducing her story to a warning strips her of her humanity. It turns her into a lesson instead of a person. And she was a person, one who trusted, one who hoped, one who believed she had time. Yessenia's life mattered long before it ended violently. It mattered in the ordinary ways that rarely make news, in her plans, in her relationships, in her quiet determination to move forward. The justice system can assign guilt. It can issue sentences. It can declare a case closed. But closure is not something it can deliver. For Yessenia's family, justice did not arrive as peace. It arrived as permanence, the permanent knowledge of what was taken, the permanent absence of someone who should still be here. And for those who hear her story, the responsibility is not just to listen, but to remember her as more than a crime. To remember her as an 18-year-old girl preparing for college, as a daughter who was loved, as a sister who was missed, as a human being whose trust was betrayed in the most irreversible way. Because true crime is not about fascination, it is about loss. And behind every case file is a name that deserves to be spoken carefully. Yessenia Gabriella Norman. She was here. She mattered. And she should never be forgotten.